Hello and welcome on into another edition of the Wolverine podcast. It is Monday, July 8th. Anthony Broom here with Clayton Safey to continue our summer positional rundowns. And again, because we're kind of pressed for time, trying to get all these out before Big Ten Media Days, we're going to combine two groups today, the edge guys and defensive tackles, and more or less just kind of focus on the two deep with a couple of X factors thrown in for good measure. Clayton, welcome on in, my friend.
Great to be here. Hope everyone had a great 4th. So, Big Ten Media Day, in a couple of weeks? And should be exciting. It's 3 days this year because of the new members of the Big Ten. And there are already conference media days this week. Big 12 this week. The Pac-2, I believe, is having a media day. I wouldn't think they would stretch it out to two, but college football is close when you get a bunch of football players and coaches in suits, putting them in one room and having them talk to sleazy reporters like us. Or at least I'll speak for myself.
Just dirtbags like us. We're coming. Your summer break is over, coaches and players. We are, of course, brought to you today by the 2024 Michigan Football Preview Magazine, which I'm told, I haven't gotten my hand on the copy yet, but is out in the wild. If you're watching the video version, Clayton is displaying it like Vanna White on The Price is Right now. It's gorgeous. I mean, I think that might be, and again, I've taken in some of these football previews pre-working for the site. I think that cover is my favorite thus far. Over 160 full color pages. You've got season predictions. You've got positional rundowns. You've got feature articles. An evaluation. I did a couple page evaluation on the 2019 recruiting class. We have a roundtable with national experts, notes section, Big Ten preview. It's all in there. Everything you want us to plant a flag on. And you say, what do you think Michigan's record will be? Oh, who do you think will be, the 10 best players in the Big Ten? It's all in there. We've planted a flag on it, and now they're out in the wild. So if you pre-ordered yours, hopefully, share with us in the comments if your copy has come. If not, we still have plenty available for you guys over at the WolverineOnDemand.com. You can order your copy today. Digital copies are also out. If I'm old school. I like to have the physical copy. I like to, flip pages and do all that stuff. I like to have something to hold in my hand so I can read while I relax. But if you're not like that, if you're an iPad person or prefer the PDF edition of it, we do have a digital copy available for you as well. It pairs great with our national championship commemorative issue, which is also still available over on the WolverineOnDemand.com. So head on over there, get your copies of both today. You will be as well read as any fan in the country when it comes to your team if you get your copy of it. All right, well, let's move. I'm going to kind of not quite flip a coin, but more put the ball in your court on this one. Would you rather start with edge guys or start with defensive tackles?
Start with the big boys on the inside.
The Hogs on the defensive interior. And I just had a depth chart pulled up, and now it's gone. Let's just start with the starting guys. It's going to be Mason Graham. It's going to be Kenneth Grant, who are two guys that, you look at most draft boards right now. Mason Graham is a top 5 player, almost, from a consensus standpoint in next year's class, which is kind of crazy to think that he was a high 3-star, a low 4-star. I forget what his recruiting ranking was, but E.J. Holland was always high on him. And I think a lot of times when they put these rankings together, it's more from what your ceiling is from an NFL development standpoint. They're trying to predict guys who are going to be drafted highly. And Mason Graham's an outlier because he came in advanced, and a lot of people said, he has a high floor. Of course, he's advanced early on. All he's done is advanced past that and gotten even better to the point where this is one of the maybe 2 or 3 best defensive players in all of college football heading into next season.
Yeah, and I was just pulling up his recruiting ranking. He was a 3-star on 3. He was a 4-star on the industry ranking, but a 3-star on another service, ESPN, 4-star on a couple others. And a few years later, he's one of the best players in America in college football. And he has the absolute ability to take over games. We've seen that on multiple occasions. I mean, the first one that comes to mind is one of the most brilliant performances by a defensive lineman I've ever seen in a game. I mean, it doesn't quite rival Aiden Hutchinson against Ohio State, but I guess if you narrow it down to interior defensive linemen, it's as impressive a display that you can have. And that's Mason Graham against Minnesota last year when he was playing with a club on one hand and still just, eating everything up in the run game, getting after their quarterback, Ethan Kaliak-Manis, in the past game. He had a few tackles for loss, and then like his other tackles were for a gain of 1 yard, 2 yards, 1 yard, no yard. I mean, it was ridiculous. So he has the ability to take over games. He shows up in the big moments. You think about we talked about this last week on the podcast with our top 10 plays of the season from last year, but right before the Jalen Milroe stop, 2 plays before, Mason Graham darts into the backfield and has a tackle for loss of 5 yards on Jace McClellan. Their running back sets them back. They get close to the goal line, but not close enough, obviously, and Michigan gets the stop. And he was a big part in on that play on the final one. So those are just a few examples of what he can do. Upside. He's got as high upside as anybody to me now when you watch him in college football. And I think it's fair to say that was a miss in recruiting. But now that you get a 3 years later, it doesn't matter. He's a dominant player, and I think he still has room to improve, which is kind of exciting for what he could become this season.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that his ceiling was so defined as a high school recruit to now, I mean, through 2 years, I mean, every step of the way, it's gotten better. It's gotten better. And this year, I mean, again, I still can't really, when I'll compare it to this. When Aiden Hutchinson, and again, I know different position, he's an edge guy. I get that. But when Aiden Hutchinson came back in 2021, I think there was, a lot of people pretty comfortably had him as a first-round pick. But, it really wasn't until he really got going that year that you start seeing him talked about top 10, top 5. He ultimately, contends for being the number 1 overall pick.
He should have gone 1. Yeah.
He should have. And for all intents and purposes, I mean,
Trent Baalke,
it worked out for him. It worked out for him. Trent Baalke, a very famous parallel or Jim Harbaugh adjacent character, I should say. It's funny how it all ties in together. But Mason Graham comes into this season ranked about as high as a pro prospect as we've seen from a Michigan defender since what? I'm trying to remember the preseason hype. I mean, was there this much preseason hype for Jabril Peppers or Devin Bush? Or I'm trying to think. I can't think of any. And it's crazy to say he has a teammate that matches this in Will Johnson. But just in terms of the hype, is there anything you can kind of compare that to?
Not really. I would put Will in a similar category, but obviously it's happening at the same time, which makes it even more amazing. And I could be missing something, but I do think part of it is if you talk about the NFL, positionally with him playing interior defensive lineman or anybody who can get after the passer and control the line of scrimmage. Those guys come at a premium, whereas maybe an off-ball linebacker like Devin Bush wouldn't have, or Jabril Peppers, who didn't really have a total set position. I know he ended up playing safety, but those guys are just a little bit different. This is I have as high of expectations for him, Will Johnson. I would throw the next guy we're going to talk about, Kenneth Grant, in this bucket as well. Like, I have as high of expectations for these guys as I have for any Michigan defender, right up there with Aiden Hutchinson. So, and even then, like you said, coming into the year, we didn't know he was going to have 14 sacks and become the number 2 overall pick. So, he's a superstar. He may not look like a superstar when he doesn't have pads on and whatever, but once you start seeing him play, he's as good as they come in college football. He might be the best player in the sport. I mean, he really might be. He's not going to get that respect, but he's absolutely dominant.
Yeah, and I say this out of a place of love, but you're right. Out of football pads, he looks like the guy you'd call to, like, move your couch out of your basement or something like that. Like, he just has that look to him. But we love Mason Graham. Terrific player. I think it's crazy to think that it can get better, because if it does, you're talking about, again, maybe top 3 prospect in the draft. Defensive tackle, it seems like there hasn't been as much star power at that position coming out of the college ranks in the last few years, and he has a chance to lead the way there, along with the guy that we talk about next here in Kenneth Graham. That junior class, my gosh, I mean, talk about hitting home runs with both of your evaluations there. Kenneth Grant comes into the season 6'3", 339. And I think a lot of, I don't want to keep, there they are. If you're watching the video version, is that another rousing example of just how many questions and how many things come up in that football preview. Kenneth Grant is a guy that, like I said, I don't want to frame everything we talk about here based on what mock drafts are saying and what, pro evaluators are saying, but more kind of that fringe first round, second round type of hype right now. But to me, I look at him and I'd have to go back and look. There was a couple summers ago where I wrote about, I don't know if it was what the defense could look like in 2023, what it could look like in 2024. It was back during maybe coming off that first college football playoff. And, you wrote about, I wrote about Kenneth Grant, why, when you look at the traits he brings to the table, when you look at the speed, the athleticism, the power, why can't he be Michigan's version of a Jordan Davis or, some of those big, stout Georgia defensive linemen? And, to me, I think we've been banging the drum for him, I feel like, all summer. I mean, he is a guy that probably deserves more hype. And again, no disrespect. This is not disrespect or comparing, contrasting with Mason Graham. But when you look at him purely from a size and athleticism and disruption standpoint, it kind of feels like he's a guy that the NFL might be more apt to fall in love with as this process goes along.
Yeah, I mean, he's an absolute freak. I wouldn't be surprised if he is the number one freak in college football, according to Bruce Feldman in August or whenever he comes out with his list of the top 100 freaks. He's got to be up there. I believe he was on there last year, around 37-ish. That sounds about right. And it's not like he's become that much more of a freak in the last year, but I just think he's shown more in game now that matches up with some of the numbers he puts up in the weight room and with agility and the way he moves for somebody that size at 6'3", 340 pounds is ridiculous. And I think he's a little bit more than that right now. He said a few weeks ago when we talked to him that he's trying to shed a little bit of weight this offseason, but he looks really good. And he's an absolute beast as well. And Mason Graham takes over games. I think Kenneth Grant has shown flashes of some of those same types of plays. I mean, his best plays are like as good as you can have for a defensive lineman. And now if he does it more consistently, which, by the way, is going to come with his increase in opportunity, then I think he is going to be an All-American type of player for Michigan. So you can do a lot if you have, if one of your best units, especially in college football, is on the line of scrimmage, whether that's the offensive line or the defensive line. And Michigan has shown that with elite defensive lines in the past. They've shown it with simultaneously having great offensive lines, but with these two in the middle, Kenneth Grant and Mason Graham, it's a hell of a starting point. And obviously the edge guys that we'll talk about soon play into that as well. But you said, I mean, this class between KG, Mason Graham, Derek Moore, Will Johnson, Colston Loveland, Zeke Berry, and you could go on and on, even Keon Sabb, who's going to start at Alabama this year. I mean, it was hit after hit after hit on the recruiting trail for the Michigan staff.
Absolutely. I don't know that I have much more to say about these two guys. I mean, again, I don't know. I think when you look at defensive tackle, it's more of a question of who's going to come in and spell these guys, because I know there's been they are going to play more snaps because Michigan is going to play in far more competitive games. It's not going to take 2 months, to play your starters into the fourth quarter like it did last year. For me, I think that defensive tackle 3 is probably the biggest question right now. You hope that it's Rayshon Benny. Of course, he's coming off an injury that he had in the Rose Bowl. And then you got a lot of guys that, you were in on a couple transfer portal guys. JVR Suggs was one of them. I think CJ West was another guy that they missed on. But, it's kind of Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, hopefully Rayshon Benny, and then a lot of question marks here. You have Trey Pierce. You've got Etta, who's, maybe kind of a hybrid guy that can play some edge, some defensive tackle. And then Ike Iwuna, who has never, I don't think, played a single snap at defensive tackle at Michigan. So to me, I mean, the biggest question here is the depth and what's the upshot of the position group? Because listen, for as athletic as Kenneth Grant is, 340 pounds of man is not going to be able to play 60, 70 snaps a game. Like there's going to have to be some kind of rotation there. And you want to keep those guys fresh as well. So what do you make of what's behind them at defensive tackle?
Yeah, and it's really interesting, too, how programs are going to be now preparing to potentially play 17 games or 16 games or whatever. Even 15 was quite a lot, but Michigan had a month break in there. You're not going to have any month-long breaks anymore in college football. So, or at least with an opponent that you're going to have. You could have several weeks off if you have a bye week, but even then, it's not going to be as long as it was. So Michigan's going to have to build the depth. They're going to have to rotate, especially if they're going to make a deep run in the college football playoff and make it far and have a successful season. Rayshon Benny, Sharon Moore said he expects him to be healthy by fall camp, or at least Lou Esposito said that. Wink Martindale talked about it with Jake Butt on a podcast recently, though, and he said, it's still a question, as to when exactly he'll be back full go. And like you said, they are going to have some big challenges early on in the year this season, so it's not going to be the same as it was. Trey Pierce is a guy who impressed behind the scenes last year, but he missed time in the spring with an injury as well. Enoeta comes over from edge to the inside, and I think that move in and of itself was indicative of a lack of depth for Michigan on the interior, but he could be a really good player. Like, he looks like somebody who can kind of play that 3 technique for Michigan. He didn't look out of place at all in the spring game, even though coming into the spring, or he said after the spring game that coming into the spring, he had no idea where he was going to play. New staff, a couple new position coaches. Obviously, things went down, kind of in a weird timeline there, sequence for the Michigan defensive linemen. So, I love what they have. It's as good of a duo as you can have, but they're going to have to develop that depth. And Wink Martindale said something interesting too, where probably those guys are going to play more snaps, at least early on in the season, than you would like them to. But they're just going to have to do it, especially with the heightened competition. Texas coming in week 2. But you can also guard against your lack of depth a little bit by maybe putting, one D tackle out there, extra edge guy on certain downs, or another linebacker in the game. You can still have enough guys in the box, where you can be successful against both the run and the pass. But again, I mean, taking guys like Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant off the field and not having a great replacement for them is still somewhat of a concern. But really, it's rich people problems in a certain sense, because you do have those 2 guys, and as long as they stay healthy, you're going to be able to get 40 plus snaps out of them.
Yeah, I want to make sure I address the true freshman coming in. I just didn't have the tab pulled up. At defensive tackle, Michigan's true freshman Ted Hammond, Owen Wafel, who else is on here? David Palapale and Manuel Beagle. All of those guys. I mean, I don't see a scenario where any of them really factor into it this year. I think when you look at what they brought in on the interior in that 2024 class, it's a lot of, and this is often the case with defensive tackles, just a lot of lotto tickets, a lot of guys with traits, a lot of guys to coach up. So we'll see what happens there. Any other thoughts on the DTs before we move into what I think is a very interesting edge room?
Yeah, I love Owen Wafel. I think down the road he's going to be an absolute dude. There's an interview on our YouTube channel here. EJ Holland sat down with him after he signed, and he's just so impressive and has the exact mentality you want a defensive lineman to have. So I would recommend going and checking that out.
All right, well, let's move to the edge room, and we'll start with those guys that we project in the starting lineup. The post-spring depth chart prediction that we had done and there's no surprises here, Derek Moore in one spot and Josiah Stewart in the other. We'll start with Josiah Stewart, who I don't want to say very quietly was one of Michigan's best pass rushers last year, but someone who I think, because you had a Braden McGregor, because you had Jalen Harrell, because you had Derek Moore in that room, I think a lot of what Josiah Stewart did was a bit, I'll say, overlooked, and maybe that's just the fact that I haven't really thought about where he stood in the pecking order last year a ton since the season ended. But 23 solo tackles last year, 5.5 sacks, a guy who kind of when we think of Michigan edge rushers, oftentimes it's these guys who, they're long, they're athletic, they're raw. They usually take some time to get up to speed. But Josiah Stewart, more of a squattier guy, 6'1", 245. Last year when we talked to him in the lead up to the season, he wanted to be kind of more of a fastball in Michigan's defensive line rotation. I thought he acquitted himself extremely well, and actually kind of surprised by the in terms of national attention, because had a few weeks to kind of thumb through a lot of these national previews now. Don't really see him mentioned a ton as like a potential all Big Ten guy, but I certainly think he has a chance to be, one of the tone setters on this defense.
I agree. And he came back for a reason. I think he's going to be able to show more of his game. It's not surprising he was on the field for more passing downs than running plays last year, but it wasn't that wide of a split when you look at it. So he had 136 plays against the run, 177 as a pass rusher, and 36 in coverage. And that 36 in coverage is right up there with some of the highest among Michigan's edge rushers. They trust him to do a lot. So just having him as this versatile weapon up front is going to be important for Michigan this season, especially because I do feel like Wink Martindale is going to go with a little bit more or a little bit less of a structure in terms of position, where your nickel might be one guy on one play and another guy in another situation. And same thing could go with where you line up Josiah Stewart. So that's going to be kind of interesting to watch. But he's fast. He's very physical, much more so than I think a lot of people expected coming in. And he's kind of the perfect complement to Derek Moore on the other side. Derek Moore being more of a big guy with the heavy hands, is very athletic as well. But Josiah Stewart, more of that speed rusher. So I just think that these two also have a lot to prove. I know we'll talk about D Moore in a second, but those two as a duo have a ton to prove because they showed a lot last year, but they were kind of in the shadow a little bit, as you mentioned. And now it's their show. And, maybe that speaks to some of the depth concerns behind them. But at the same time, it's a real opportunity for them to take control of what this defensive line is going to look like. We know what the interior is, and now it's going to be, can these guys get after the passer and set the edge? And I just think that, both of them can do both of those things.
Yeah, Stewart in particular. I think that both he and Derek Moore are going to be capable, because we know, and we've seen them do this or seen Michigan's edge guys do this in Mike McDonald's scheme. They've done it in Jesse Minter's scheme, but Wink does like to drop those guys back a little bit more. I think they're athletic enough to handle that. I think that, they'll be smart about it, though. I don't think they're just going to drop them back there or put them, ensure that they're on a tight, stuff like that. I think it'll be smart. They'll be used appropriately. Derek Moore is someone who I think it would be natural for a guy as highly recruited as he was to want to. It just seems like his freshman year, he could have. There were opportunities where he maybe could have been on the field more, but you had Mike Morris and you had the guys that we mentioned before, McGregor, Jalen Harrell. I actually give him a ton of credit in today's. We just know that everyone and everything has a price tag on it these days. And the fact that he has stuck around, the fact that he is someone who has a chance to be, as highly as I think of Josiah Stewart, the fact that Derek Moore is here. Junior seasons, often when we see these guys make the biggest leap as a player, just in terms of rounding into something that approximates what their final form is going to be. If we're making a list of breakout guys on this entire roster, I think you could make a case that he could be somewhere in the top 3, top 4. It's interesting though, because so much of the storylines of, that surround this football team have to do with guys that we're not really sure of, guys that we haven't seen a ton of. We've seen a lot of Derek Moore. The thing is, I think that we have a chance to see even more of him in a breakout sort of star-making turn this year.
Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think he can make a pretty big leap and become one of these next Michigan edge rushers that have gotten drafted. On the flip side of the coin, where you give him credit for sticking around, think about how much success Michigan edge rushers have had, not only in college, but going to the NFL. They've had 10 drafted just since 2017, which is crazy. I believe it's 10. Actually, it might be higher than that. So, yeah, it is higher than that. It's 11 with Jalen Harrell having gone this last season. as I do terrible math here on the podcast. That's why we're sports writers. I hate math. But he feels like, to me, one of the next guys in line, and, to kind of take control of that position. And with the questions of what the rotation is going to look like behind Derek Moore and Josiah Stewart, I think he could be somebody who does push towards double-digit sacks, and same goes for Stewart as well. But Derek Moore against the run is really good too, and I think that's something that often gets overlooked with edge rushers, because we look at pressures and we look at sacks, but especially in Michigan's defense, they put a lot on that front four, and even really the front seven in general. Sometimes it's six guys to stop the run with a light box, not putting a lot of resources in there. And even when they don't make the tackle, they have to destroy the blocks to free up the other guys to get the ball carrier down. So he does that really well. And that might be an underappreciated aspect of his game, but it's going to pay dividends if he's playing like that, and Josiah Stewart takes a leap as well, plus what you have next to them. It's going to be an elite defensive line. It's going to be, something that you hang your hat on each game. Every single offense is going to have to prepare and account for each one of those guys. Who do you double? Who do you not? Who do you slide the protection towards? Who do you not? And I don't have those answers for you, because I don't think there's a good one.
Yeah, the one thing that I find interesting about just maybe that starting four of Stewart, Moore, Grant, Graham is PFF kind of started the conversation. I think it was about a month or so ago. It was about this time last month where they put out a graphic of the guys that they have that Ohio State has coming back, the guys that Michigan has coming back. And JTT and Jack Sawyer are carrying a lot of weight there on said graphic. I wrote a story about it too. But this Michigan front has the ability to be, I think it could be the best in the Big Ten. I think it could be one of the best in all of college football. And that is so important for them, given that schematically things are going to look a bit different. But, forget about, all the people sort of having a hard time wrapping their minds around the idea that Wink Martindale might like to run a little more man defense, might like to do things a little more aggressively. And even he's addressed the fan base's comparisons to him and Don Brown. When you have a defensive line that's this good and this disruptive, and really, when you think about it, this well-rounded too, they can stop the run. They can rush the passer. I think that there's probably even more pass rush upside there. That's going to take so much heat off of the back two levels of the defense. And when you have a linebacker room that, we'll talk about them in a future episode, that we think has a chance to be as good as it can. When you have Will Johnson back there on an island, when you've got some of the players they brought in via the portal. I mean, if that defensive line takes a step forward, and I think there's reason to believe they can, 3 of those guys are juniors. This is one of the best overall units in college football. And I don't think there's, even without that jump, I think they're that. So it's going to be a lot of fun to watch.
No doubt. And I think the one concern is the depth. If somebody goes down, or if you need to bring in some others, then and somebody is needing a blow in the middle of a game. They talked last year about those rally groups that were ready to go on the defensive line that would come in after 3, 4, 5 plays in a series. They'd rally, they'd do 3, 4 plays, and then that would kind of spell the guys who were in that possession would come back in. If you don't have this quality of players there, then it's not going to be potentially as good. But at the same time, sometimes when we make these comparisons to last year's group, we have to remind ourselves that that was a ridiculously deep and talented defense and team in general that went 15-0, and you're probably not going to go undefeated every year. So, at some point you have to just look at it for what it is, and it's really damn good. And obviously TJ Guy is probably the top name that we can talk about with providing depth. And Sharon Moore said that nobody, there were times during spring ball where, hey, nobody can block, or is anybody going to block TJ Guy today? I guess were his exact words. And that's a good thing to hear, because he's appeared in some of these games where he shows up late in the game and then he'll just be shot out of a cannon and make a sack. And you're like, wait, that was TJ Guy. That was 42. we haven't seen him all year. He comes in and looks good, and he's looked good in multiple spring games now. So I think it's his turn, and he's right in the mold of like a Mike Morris who had to wait really until his senior season to have the role that he wanted, and then he goes on and has a huge year. So I feel like is that comparison? And I think he was mentored by Mike Morris as well. But do you agree with that comparison, that it just feels like he may not be a starter this year? I wouldn't expect it, obviously, but it just feels like he's kind of next to have been maybe forgotten about for a year or two, but now he rises to a prominent role.
I think from that standpoint, the comparison works. Obviously, from a pure one-to-one play style, it's a little bit different. But the fact that, yeah, no, I know you weren't saying that. I can see that, and I can see him being a guy that, he could be sort of a guy that can be a dude. I see guy as a guy that can be a dude. That's the most succinct expert analysis I can give on that. But no, I think he could be someone that maybe he has just like a big year and dips. I don't know about that. Obviously, I don't think he would have a 5th year of eligibility, if I'm not mistaken. I'd have to look.
I think he does.
Like we saw him a bit. I'll workshop that here in a second, but I think he's clearly your number 3 edge. I think edge 4 is kind of where things get a little more interesting, and maybe they don't. Maybe edge 4 is a mishmash of different guys and different types of things. Maybe sometimes it's Eno Etta. Maybe sometimes it's Jay-Sean Barham as someone that they bring off the edge. Maybe sometimes it's, I don't know. I don't see, it seems like the last few, and like you said, it goes back to your questions about depth. The last few really good Michigan teams had 4 guys there. And this group does not have 4 guys. They have 2 for sure. We think they have a 3rd in TJ Guy. But, I would also say about him, like the fact that he hasn't seen the field also speaks to what has been ahead of him too. I think in a lot of other places,
exactly.
TJ Guy's probably on the field a lot 2 years ago. So I do think, when we talk about breakout guys, I think he fits the mold there as well.
Yeah. Just looking at it here, he does have a 5th year if he wants it. He redshirted in 2021. So this could be a 2-year push for TJ Guy. Maybe he's starting in a couple seasons, but him, I think Cam Brandt is going to be one to watch. I think he could break out. But like you said, it's like we just haven't seen him enough, but he's somebody that Mike Elston loved behind the scenes last year and played pretty well in games when he got in. So I think he could be somebody who really rises to the occasion. He's versatile. He can play standing up. He can play with his hand in the dirt too, as kind of that big end. And then there are other guys too. There are guys coming in this freshman class this summer that could impact, like a Baxter, Devin Baxter, but somebody we saw in the spring game who wasn't even as highly touted as him or Lugard. I'm not even going to try to pronounce his last name right now without having
Edekpaye.
Okay. I'll take you at your word there that's correct. But those 2 were the more highly touted ones. But then Dom Nichols in the spring game was somebody we spent probably 3 or 4 minutes talking about how good he looked late in that game as well. So I think based on what Lou Esposito has said and what some of the other coaches have said, and even the players, talking to Cam Brandt after the spring game, they're a little bit more impressed with what they have depth-wise at the edge position than they might have thought coming into spring ball. Again, it's one of the reasons why Eno Etta was able to move inside, is because they have other options. But Dom Nichols, look for him. Like you said, you could piece things together. What if you move Jay-Sean Barham to edge in certain situations and you bring in a Jimmy Rolder in the middle? That could be a possibility. And, we couldn't get through this one. I know it's not linebackers yet, but without a Cole Sullivan mention, he looks like a guy that could play the edge as well. That might be his position down the road. Who knows? I know he's playing inside linebacker right now, but he seems like somebody that's too good to keep off the field and say, hey, or you could just tell him, hey, go get after the passer if you put him at the edge position. So bunch of different thoughts there, but there are names out there at the edge position, maybe more than any other spot on the field for Michigan, where people don't really even know who these guys are yet, and they could make an impact just because, Breon Ishmael is a guy you could also mention as well. Americ Kumba. I mean, guys that have not been talked about in the past. Like you said, it speaks to what was ahead of them. But now some of that production's gone, and there's an opportunity there. So it'll be interesting to see who takes some of those roles, because it could be any number of guys.
Can't believe I almost went through a podcast talking about edge guys and not talking about Breon Ishmael, who I think is so fascinating. I mean, I think his senior year of high school, he weighed in like 215 or something, and then last summer he showed up like 260. I forget what it was, but that guy's a freak, and that's maybe something to look at a year down the road. But maybe those guys factor into edge 4.
He was putting guys on their asses in the spring game. I'll tell you that.
It was outstanding. We had a lot of fun watching that. So, any other thoughts on defensive line, edge, defensive tackle?
It's going to be good. And the depth, like, it's a question mark and concern right now, but I just feel like as they get healthier there, Trey Pierce, Rayshon Benny, like, they're going to be just fine, especially on the interior. And then, like we said, they can piece things together on the outside if you have to take out a Derek Moore or Josiah Stewart. So I think you're looking at a really good front seven in general, especially the starting lineup, that is going to be the strength of this team and going to cause a bunch of issues for opponents. How are you going to game plan against these guys where you don't think maybe you can run the ball all that successfully or consistently at least? And then when you do drop back, if you don't have a really damn good quarterback who has some wheels to him and has mobility and the smarts and awareness to get out of the pocket and move in the pocket, then you're kind of doomed against this Michigan defense. So they may suffocate you. If Michigan can get some leads in games this year, that defensive line could start to take over, pin their ears back, as they say, and get after these quarterbacks and offensive lines and running backs and everything.
Yes, sir. We are looking forward to seeing it. We do have questions to take to close out this show. In my hasty pre-production, did not put out a thread earlier, but put one right before we started recording, or right as we started recording, and the fort came through, Clayton. They came through in a big way. So I don't know if you have, are you seeing what I'm seeing here? So if you want to just let it rip. Whenever you reach into the grab bag, I never know what's coming out. So let's see what you got.
We did have a Hawk Tua question a couple weeks ago. We won't get into that right now. But Jamar1123 says, what are 3 things that need to happen for Michigan to have another championship type of season? Great question.
Good health, first and foremost. I think good health will. That was a big part of last year that people don't necessarily realize.
And they got lucky. Like, even within that, they had guys that got hurt, but they got back healthy at like the perfect time, or even just back healthy at all. Like Mason Graham got hurt. Junior Colson was playing with like no hands for a couple of games. He had a broken hand and a club on the other two for some other reason. And then JJ McCarthy was limping like crazy at the end of the Penn State game, during the Maryland game. And then you start to hear from our sources throughout Ohio State week, like, no, he's moving better this week. It's like, I mean, that is, if he wasn't, they wouldn't have been able to win that game. So yeah, sorry to go on a tangent there, but they had pretty good luck with that. And obviously you credit the players, you credit the some of them playing through pain, and you credit the strength staff and the work everybody puts in to put themselves in that position. But yeah, good health, great quarterback play. I think you need great quarterback play to have a championship season. That could look like your quarterback running for 1,100 yards. It could also look like him throwing for 3,000. There are a lot of different shapes and sizes that could come in, but I'd say good quarterback play. I mean, what else? Great line play. I mean, these are kind of general. It's a great question. These are kind of general.
Great QB play was going to be my number 3. So as just like a composite of the two of us, I think that pretty well covers it.
What was your last one?
It was good health. Well, maybe that was number 1. Good health and good quarterback play. So I didn't have a third one. So now I need to come up with a third.
Well, we got 3. We got 3 on the board.
Yeah, I'll just say, like, the one thing here is those games that Sharon Moore coached. Again, I'm not putting this on Sharon. Super weird circumstances for why he was out there. the last 3 games of the regular season, but there was just a different level of attention to detail when Jim Harbaugh was there. It was a little sloppier, right? Just a little bit. And again, it was, an emotional time. It was a crazy few weeks. I think you need your head coach, your CEO as much as we think we know about him, he's got a lot to prove stepping into the big chair. So I think a steady hand in that kind of head coach CEO role, I think would be my number 3 as well.
I like it. I like that. Coach W says, looking forward to this season. Who will be the team leaders in 2025? He's looking forward to this season, and he's skipping right over this season and wondering about team leaders in 25. Really hard to predict down the road in college football in general, based on the transfer portal and how many moving parts there are, and who leaves for the NFL draft, of course, right? I mean, if Will Johnson, Mason Graham, Kenneth Grant, Derek Moore, Colston Loveland decide to come back in 25, of course, they're going to be team leaders. Maybe 1 or 2 of them do for one reason or the other. Obviously, they have a lot of NFL potential there. So it'd be somebody out of that group. In terms of guys down the road, like if, Gio El-Hadi uses his last year, you feel like him or Crippen would be, Ernest Hausman, if he doesn't have he would have another year. Jayshon Barham is more of a quieter player, but he'd be in year 2 there in one of the vets. So it depends on who comes back, man. I think it'd be all the top players who come back.
I mean, is Rod Moore a candidate to be back for a 5th year? Like, I don't want to speculate on that.
Talk about Rod Moore in just a second. Should we segue that?
Yeah, let's just segue to that. I think you pretty well covered that one.
Tremendous Blue says MGO blog posted a link to an article saying Rod Moore could be back mid-season. Have you heard anything like that? That article, I assume, is similar to the one we wrote last week with Lamar Morgan, Michigan secondary coach, his comments on the In the Trenches podcast about how, Rod will be, he was talking about how Rod Moore has become a coach and how Rod Moore is one of the more impressive guys he's seen after getting injured. He's in the meeting room and helping all the other guys out. And he's actually meeting individually with the transfer DBs that Michigan has brought in, which, kudos to Rod Moore for doing all that and being as engaged as he is. And it's not a surprise, right? He's probably number 1 on the list. If somebody were to get hurt and be doing this, I would probably guess it would be Rod Moore. And it is. So but his comment there was that Rod's going to be out, at least the first half of the season. It was kind of, to me, listening to it, kind of just like a general comment where you didn't want to get into specifics about the injury. But it does sound like there's a possibility that he comes back at some point. I know our Chris Ballas has reported on that, how Rod Moore has told, some people that he's hoping to be back for Ohio State. I think that's great motivation for him. I hope he just gets healthy, but it's certainly possible now, depending on the severity of his knee injury, that they come back. Guys like Jake Ryan have come back pretty quick, and that was even, 10 years ago or close to 15 at this point. So it's definitely possible, but I'm not willing to put some sort of expectation on it.
Yeah, I mean, that would be the ultimate, cinematic storyline. Like the guy who called game of the last Ohio State game sprints onto the field in Columbus like the ultimate warrior, just shot out of a cannon. It would be great to have him back. I'll even say before that, I mean, Oregon, I think, for what my money's worth, is still, I have less question marks about Oregon than Ohio State. And I think they are the team to beat in the Big Ten. It's going to be close. I think those teams will probably play a few times. But yeah, we'll see. It would be great to have him back for November football, which is championship football.
The only thing that concerns me about his potential return this season is he got hurt in late March and he didn't have surgery until late April. That tells me that they probably, one, maybe the swelling was so bad or whatever. I'm not a doctor. But 2, they probably didn't have intention for him to come back this season. It's a total guess on my part. But since we were asked the question, I guess that is a thought that comes to mind as well, waiting a whole month before getting his surgery. But let's see. Jamar1123 has another good question. Who are 3 players from the offense and the defense that are not being talked about much, but could turn out being major contributors this season?
3 on each side of the ball. Am I understanding that one correctly?
No, just some players. Or no, he does say 3. Yeah, my bad. Just name a few.
Yeah, I'll rapid fire because we've kind of hit on these throughout the year. I think Fred Moore is up there. I think that we should be talking more about Kalel Mullings. And I think that Marlon Klein is going to have a pretty big role in this team. So that's offense. Defensively, we've hit on a couple of these guys. I think that, Eno Etta is going to have a big role on this team. TJ Guy is going to have a big role in this team. And I know there was like initial excitement about it when the transfer happened, but I think that Wesley Walker is going to be one of the better players on this defense as well. So those would be my 3.
Yeah, I think I would put Amir Hall maybe in that category. We'll see how he's the corner transfer from Albany. We'll see how he transitions up from that level. Yeah, I mean, you named about everybody. I mean, I feel like, yeah, I mean, people talk about Jair Hill and guys like that could really emerge in their second year. So I guess they don't fall under that category. But
that's the tough part, is that people are like, oh, that aren't being talked about a ton. It's like we don't have a frame of reference for that, because I feel like all we do is talk about all these guys or write about all these guys. So
luckily we get paid for it.
Yeah, I'm trying to take like a mainstream sort of perspective to it in terms of like,
right,
say a guy I know who's a Michigan fan, but like isn't as in the weeds as we are. Like we're putting names on their radar.
I think that's a good
how I look at it.
That's a good way to think about it for sure.
Yeah.
That was about 6, I'd say. Surprise offensive skill position player this year from Jim Rome stinks.
I feel like
Kalel,
but is that a surprise though? I mean, we're talking about a guy that's made plays in the Rose Bowl. We're talking about guys who, has made some big. I mean, yeah, it could be a surprise, but yeah, I mean, again, thinking of it from the layperson perspective, and I'm not. That's not like an insult. It's just, yeah, I mean, all the hype this offseason coming off the national title game has been Donovan Edwards, and then he's on the cover of the video game, and he's now in a YouTube video playing the game, and he's at all these NIL events. We'll be at one on Tuesday where he's in attendance. Yeah, Kalel Mullings works for me.
But I think your Fred Moore pick from earlier was very good as well. We got some over-unders from TB12 Jr. He's throwing it back. We used to have this segment on the pod years ago. Over-under, I'll throw them out here. 1,000 rushing yards for Donovan Edwards.
Over.
I'm going to go over, too.
1,200.
Over under 8 rushing touchdowns for Alex Orji.
I'm going to say under.
That's a really good line. I'm going to go over. I don't think they have Kalel Mullings is their short yardage back. If he's a starting quarterback, it goes over. But I'll agree with you. I'll go under. Does Rod? If
I was setting a line for that, I would set it at like 5.5.
Yeah, I think that's fair, especially because he hasn't won the job, at least yet. Does Rod Moore, this is not an over-under, but does Rod Moore play in the semifinals or finals? Parentheses, if we get there and he's medically cleared. I would hope he'd be medically cleared if he plays. I don't believe Sharon would let him go out there if he doesn't. I'm going to say no, but obviously I hope he does, and I hope he's back as soon as possible.
I'm going to say no, too, just because I don't want something we say here to get clipped as, oh, Michigan reporters say that Rod Moore is going to be back in time for the, I don't want that to be like, not that people write clickbait.
Hold on, say it again.
No, I'm not going to. Yeah, I'm going to say no, just because I don't want to put an expectation on him, and I don't want to be like tied to any sort of false hope, just in case.
It's fair. Do we make the playoff with 3 losses? And if those 3 losses are to Texas, Oregon, and Ohio State, so you'd still have some marquee wins on this. You know, it means that you beat Washington. It means you beat USC, and you took care of business against everybody else. I think that will help. The committee doesn't just look for good wins; they look for good losses, and those would be 3 of them.
I mean, it depends on what they look like, right?
Yeah, that's a good point too.
If you get blasted by Oregon and Ohio State and just barely beat, a rebuilding Washington team, or, just barely eke by USC, like, it comes down to what the totality of it looks like. I don't think just stamping 9-3 gets it done. But if it's 9-3,
right,
and yeah, I mean, it's all about what it looks like.
What if you swap out? Yeah, go ahead.
No, I mean, if they're all close competitive losses, I think you can make that case. And I certainly think that, because again, despite the field expanding, this is still an invitational. This is still a TV product that the college football playoff wants to put together. If they can justify putting Michigan in at number, at 9-3, knowing what we know about the TV numbers they bring in, I think they'll do it. But again, it has to be a justifiable reason to do so. They can't lose to Oregon by 3 scores. They can't, get pumped by Ohio State or Texas, or just barely squeak by Northwestern. You know what I mean? Like, it has to look good.
No, that's a great point, because they take that into account, and there are going to be other 3-loss teams that you're comparing yourself to. What if we swapped out a loss to Texas or Oregon, made one of those a win, right? Let's say they beat Texas, but they lose to, that third loss is to USC or Washington. It'd be a little worse of a loss there, but you'd have a win against what we presume will be at least a top 10 team, and it would kind of prop everything up. And let's say you look pretty impressive in most of the rest of the games. Then I actually think it gives Michigan a better chance, even though, you'd hate to lose to a team you feel like you're better than in Washington or something like that, but you'd also have a bigger win on your resume. It's tough to say, because you could go both ways with the good win versus good loss debate, and we don't know what the committee does. There's no precedent for the 11-team or 12-team playoff. I'm thinking you'd have to be number 11, probably, or 10 or 11, and then the 12 goes to the highest ranked group of 4 or group of 5 champion.
Yeah. I'll just make this prediction. We won't think too much on it, but I think 9-3 is enough for them to, that little push notification you get on the ESPN app as the show starts, the little, will Michigan be in? Tune in now to find out. I think 9-3 will be enough for you to be on the push notification, if that's what we want to describe it as. But
definitely,
I really do feel like 10 is the magic number.
And then we'll be in a ballroom filming them during the selection show. They'll get their draw, and everyone will think they're scared of whatever team that they end up dominating. So, not dominating, but this one ties along with it. Mason Blue says, "What's your gut feeling on Michigan winning more than 10 games this season?" My gut feels they won't win more than 10 games. The schedule's really hard. They have a lot to replace. Question mark at quarterback. I mean, that's enough for me to say that my gut feeling is less than 10. Or I guess less than 11.
Yeah, I have them at 10-2 in the football preview. Whoops, spoiler alert. You better get that to see the rest of it. But I have them at 10-2. I think they'll beat Texas. I think they'll beat USC. I think I could see November being a bit, I don't want to say deflating is the word, but I just feel like Oregon and Ohio State in this year's Big Ten, I think, are just a cut above Michigan. And if Michigan solves the quarterback thing and those concerns are quickly satiated, I think that's, maybe we're having a different discussion. But I think I would have Michigan at the tippy top of that second tier.
Yeah, I can see that. I will say, in terms of excitement, like, mathematically, there are going to be so many teams still in the mix in November that it's going to make for such a fun college football season, because that Oregon game, even if you lose it and that is your third loss, like, you still have hope. If you can beat Indiana, Northwestern, and go down to Ohio State and pull off an upset, you do have hope. You're on the push notification that you're talking about going into the selection show. So no game will ever mean as much as Michigan Ohio State did last year, but there will be a lot of meaning to a lot more games, just not quite as much, but there will be meaning to more games. And that's going to make it exciting. So you have some more of a buffer there to work with. If you lose a couple games, you can still get in the playoff. You can still compete for the Big Ten championship, that sort of thing.
Yeah, I agree with all that. Summer is flying by already, but gosh, I want this football season to start because this is going to be a lot of fun to defend a national title coming up, with the schedule that they have. If you're a program that has aspirations of staying in that conversation, then you absolutely revel in this. You're excited for it, and you roll the ball out there and see what happens. So I think that's going to do it for us today. Be sure, if you're watching on YouTube, to like this video, subscribe to the channel for more content. A lot of great stuff coming over the next several weeks leading up to the season. I believe it's 54 days from today now, on Monday, that Michigan will kick off against Fresno State. I did not tease this at the top of the show, so my apologies for that on 3, but you can join the Wolverine for 2 months for only $1 using the promo code UM1. That gets you access to stuff behind the paywall, gets you access to the message board, which is where all of the questions you just heard us answer came from. So use that promo code UM1, $1 for 2 months of access over at the Wolverine. And head to thewolverineondemand.com. Get your copy of our football preview. Get your copy of our national championship magazine. A lot of great stuff over there as well. So for Clayton Safey, for our producer Megan behind the scenes, I'm Anthony Broom. Thank you for watching. We will talk to you again next time.